It's a great thing that God has given us this ability. Otherwise, it's hard to imagine being separated all these months and never seeing one another. So today, we are going to look in Hebrews chapter 11. So if you want to look in your Bible, I'm going to read the passages as well. We won't read the whole chapter, but we'll just look at a few passages, a few stories. Because I wanted to think about what does it look like and what does it take to consistently, faithfully, obediently follow Jesus. Because life is hard. There's lots of different hardships in our lives. There's lots of physical hardships, sickness, but then there's also sin. Temptation to sin from outside, pressure on us, and then temptation even in our own hearts to sin and to stop following after Jesus. And when we're thinking about that, there's sometimes what we try to do is we say, I know I should live this way. This is my duty, right? God deserves me to live this way. And so we try to live our lives out of duty and our own strength, which maybe you can start like that. Maybe it will work a little bit. Maybe it will work every now and then, but it will always fail because of our weakness. So in Hebrews chapter 11, it gives us a lot of snapshots of people's lives from the Old Testament. And in here, it keeps saying by faith or through faith. So it's like by faith, these people live this way, following after God. So I just want to think about what does that mean to live by faith? How did they live their lives? So that maybe we can learn from their example of how we can live our lives faithfully for God. And what does faith mean? Faith, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's belief, trust, confidence in something or someone. Right? In English, we say we have faith in something. In Hindi, we put faith on something or someone. So the first verse we'll read is in Hebrews chapter 11 in verse 6. It says, and without faith, it is impossible to please him, this is God, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So he's saying, first off, it's impossible. We can't even approach God. We can't come near to God without faith, right? That is the beginning of, that's how we start our journey with Jesus, is through faith. But that's not just how we start our journey, but it's how we continue our journey, by faith. So it says we must believe that God is, we must believe that God exists, right, first off. And then the second part of that is the part I really want us to focus on today, that he rewards those who seek him. Thinking about that reward aspect. What does that mean? And how does that affect our faith and how we live? So I want to look at, first we'll look at Abraham, his example, and then we can look at Moses and what it says about them in Hebrews chapter 11. So in verse 8, it says, by faith Abraham obeyed God when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with God of the same promise. Maybe you're familiar with the story of Abraham. It's from Genesis, starting in chapter 12. But God comes to Abraham and says, I want you to leave your homeland. I want you to leave your family. I want you to go somewhere, and I'm not even going to tell you exactly where it is right now. I just want you to start going. I will tell you, I will lead you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and you will be a blessing. You will be a blessing to all of the world, all of the nations, all of the peoples. But if you're familiar with the story, you also know this, that throughout Abraham's life, he didn't see all of this happen. He didn't see all of God's promises fulfilled. He saw parts. He had God lead him. He saw God, after many, many years, finally give him one son. Not a great nation, but just one son. And yeah, in the passage it says that he lived in the land of promise. So this land that God had promised him, he lived there. He did reach it, but he lived there as in a foreign land. He lived in tents. It wasn't his. It was someone else's. So even in thinking about these characters, we always remember, right, that they are flawed like we are. When you read the accounts, you're like, why did they do so many stupid things? But with Abraham, God makes a point of saying over and over again, in the Old Testament and then in the New Testament, he's held up as a man who had great faith, that he believed God. He believed God's promises, even though he didn't see them completely fulfilled. And so we're thinking, okay, how do we do that? Because we know, like, we have promises we've received from God. And we don't, it's not always apparent, right, that those things are going to happen, or that it is even like that, like in the moment. But it says in verse 10, it says, talking about Abraham, it says, for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So it's saying he obeyed God, he walked with God, he went to this land, he believed those promises that God had given, and he looked forward. He was like, I know God has promised this, I know who God is, and I believe these promises. So by faith, by trusting in God and by trusting in God's promises, I will continue following after God. And then in verse 23, we see the example of Moses. It says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So if you aren't familiar with this part of the story, Moses, one of Abraham's descendants, they had become a great nation. They had become a great people, but they were living in Egypt, and they were slaves to the Egyptians. And the king of Egypt had said, there's too many Israelites. There's too many of these people. So when they're born, we need to just kill all of them as they're being born. That way there won't be too many of them, and they'll be a threat to us. But Moses, because of his parents' faith, they kept him alive. But it says, but Moses was hidden, and then he was put in a basket and put in the river. And then it ended up floating down, and he was found by one of Pharaoh's daughters, one of the king's daughters, who raised him as her own son. Okay, so it says here in verse 24 of Hebrews chapter 11, it says, by faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. So he lived a life of privilege. He was in the king's household, right? So it's like you can't get much higher than that kind of life. But he came to this point of, will I follow God? Or will I continue in this life of sin and living for myself? And he chose living for God. It says that he even, and he knew exactly what he was getting into. He knew exactly what it would mean to turn his back on his life of privilege. And it said that, it says he chose. He said, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God. So that wasn't just like, oh, it just happened, but he actively chose. He was like, I'm not going to live this life. I'm going to live this life with God's people. Knowing that it would mean hardship, knowing that it would be difficult. And it says in verse 26, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. He was thinking about who God is, God's promises, who God can be in my life. And he says, that's worth more than all of this other that I have in my life. Than all of the pleasure that sin can bring, than all of the pleasure that wealth can bring. He says, this is better. It's better to be with God. And then in verse 32, he has the writer of Hebrews. He goes through this long list of a lot of times he doesn't even mention the names or like who the people are. But if you go back and to read the Old Testament, sometimes you can figure out like, oh, who is he talking about? But I just want to think about, he's talking about listing all these people who live by faith. And he says, starting in verse 32, it says, what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith, by faith, they conquered kingdoms, they enforced justice, they obtained promises, they stopped the mouths of lions, they quenched the power of fire, they escaped the edge of the sword, they were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Okay, so far we're saying, yes, these are the kinds of people we want to be. This is what sometimes we would think, okay, this is what life looks like of living by faith, that God will do these great things. But then he continues on, he doesn't stop. So we're in verse 35, and it says, and some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, wandering about in deserts and mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. We're like, well, that's not really the life we want. But even in those hardships, right, it says they lived this life. They continued seeking God. They continued following after God, no matter what was happening. And it wasn't even like, we don't look at this list and say, oh, like that first group where things went well, they must have had great faith. And maybe these other people had, a little less faith. Maybe they had a small amount of faith, just enough to get them by. No, but one part I skipped in verse 38, as it's listing about the people who endured such great hardship. It says, of whom the world was not worthy. It's almost like the writer is writing this, and he's like, being directed by the Holy Spirit, and he's listing all these, and he's saying, these people I'm writing about, the world was not even worthy. There was nothing wrong with them. They were actually too good to be here on this earth. Their faith, like how they saw God and their relationship with God, was so great. The world was not worthy of them being here. And in verse 39 it says, and all of these, though commended through faith, it's like they're held up. These people had faith in God. They lived by faith in God. They did not receive what was promised. They didn't see the end in their lives of all of God's promises to them. And if we can back up to verse 13 through 17, it kind of has a summary. Because it says, these all died in faith, right? All these people we're reading about here in Hebrews chapter 11, they're all long dead, right? Even when this author is writing, they've been dead for so many years. He says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus, make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. And so thinking about these examples that were given of what does it look like to live by faith, I think one of the main things we need to take away from this chapter, and I would encourage you to go back and read through it later on, is that they don't actually give us a lot of details of what did it look like. They mention a few events, this person did this person did this, but one of the things they keep coming back to is more of the why, or how. How did they do this? Because with Abraham, right, it said he looked forward to the city whose foundation and builder is God. When it was talking about Moses, it was saying that he considered the reproach of Christ of greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. He was looking to the reward. Here we see all these people. It says they received promises and they didn't see the fulfillment, but they were looking and they were seeking something better. And often it uses this example of a city or a country or a homeland, a home. And at the center of that is God. They were like, that is what we want. We want God. And so then if that is the desire, that is the goal, then it doesn't matter what happens in the in-between, because they stayed focused and they trusted in God and his promises. Because they desired true and lasting joy in their lives, right? The world brings us joy. We won't deny, right? You don't sin because it's horrible. You sin because in that moment you think that will make you happy. You think that doing that will bring you joy. But so we have to constantly be reminding ourselves of what is it that we're desiring? What is it that we're looking to? One author that I've grown up reading is C.S. Lewis. And some of you have probably read some of his books. You're probably familiar with this quote. But my mind goes back to it often. C.S. Lewis said, "It would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making lead pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased." That we can live our lives satisfied with a little bit of joy, with a little bit of happiness that will come and then it goes. But God comes and he offers us joy everlasting, a home eternally. And this is even the example, right, that Jesus sets for us. In Hebrews chapter 12, right after going through chapter 11, in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, it says, talking about how do we run this race? How do we live this life of following God? It says, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. You know, Jesus had that goal too. He was like the joy of what he was accomplishing. You know, so coming up with a list of do's and don'ts, while those may be right, that motivation, the desire to do that is not going to last. But when our joy, and when our motivation and our desire is God, to be with him, to enjoy the promises that he's given us of joy and peace, that is what will help us to live our lives, to continue living our lives by faith and trust in God. Until we can be included in these all died in faith. They lived their lives trusting in God, seeking the joy that he would bring. So my encouragement is just to think about that. Look at these passages. Think about the promises that God gives us in the Bible and desire that greater joy, desire the greater wealth, desire the better country, the better life that we can have in God. Thank you.